Next on this list is a game that is one of Namco's most popular 3D fighting games they have ever made, and in my opinion should have been the rival to Sega's Virtua Fighter. And that's game number 20, Tekken. One of the most iconic series for the system and a new impact to the fighting game genre. Published and developed by Namco. The story is about Kazuya Mishima when he was 5 years old. His father, Heihachi Mishima, wanted to see his son's strength and to see if he's fit to lead the Mishima Zaibatsu and could run the family business once he gets older. So what does he do in order for his son to achieve this? Well, the solution is simple. The father does this by killing off her mother in the process, throwing his 5-year-old son down a mountain cliff as a test to see if he's strong enough to survive the fall and climb out, and the father adopting a Chinese orphan named Li Chaolin and raises him as a rival to his true sons if he ever survived the fall. Holy shit, already a few seconds in and the story is kinda messed up now that I'm telling you about it. Okay, going back to it, Kazuya did eventually survive the fall, but left a huge scar on his chest, which causes a demonic entity within him, called the Devil Gene, when activated, offering Kazuya the opportunity to gain immense strength and power, and also driven by his thirst for revenge. He climbs up the mountainside and gets his revenge on his father. 21 years later, Kazuya is now grown up as a young adult and is finally ready to seek revenge on his father. Heihachi, now knowing that his son is still alive many years later, he decides to test his son's strength and might by announcing the King of the Iron Fist tournament, in which the two would meet in the finals and the winner would get a cash prize. Kazuya, which he signed in because of revenge, along with 7 other participants who signed in on the tournament, which includes Paul Phoenix, a hot-headed American biker and martial artist who regularly enters the tournament to prove he is the toughest fighter in the universe and rival to Kazuya. Martial Law, a martial artist who owns a restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, and a Bruce Lee lookalike, who enters the tournament due to financial difficulty of his restaurant. Nina Williams, a martial artist but also an assassin for hire and the daughter of an Irish father and former assassin Richard Williams, along with her rival sister Anna, who enters the tournament just to assassinate the head of Mishima Zaibatsu Heihachi. Jack 1, a fighting robot disguised as a human and were originally created by the Mishima Zaibatsu, who enters the tournament by Heihachi so he could take in the order to take down Kazuya, leader Yoshimitsu, a leader of the Honorable Maji clan, and also ninjutsu and swordsman due to having mechanical prosthetic arms, who enters the tournament as a decoy so as to follow the other Majis to steal the tournament's funds dedicated to helping the weak and fighting oppositions. King I, a former ruthless street-brawling orphan, now became a Catholic priest and also a masked luchador wrestler who enters the tournament because of a dream of building an orphanage for street children. And finally, Michelle Shang, a very young Chinese and native fighter from Arizona, and also possesses a mysterious pendant allegedly capable of controlling evil and powerful spirits, enters the tournament because of revenge due to Heihachi killing her father after failing to retrieve the treasure. You choose these 8 fighters and have to duke it out, and after that, facing your rival, but with each player. Can you win the Iron Fist tournament and beat Heihachi at your own risk? Well, beat your opponents and find out. Before we talk about its development history, let me take you back in the arcades in the early 90s. At the time, they were ruling the video game industry. The most notable ones are the fighting arcade games, such classics like Fatal Fury, Street Fighter 2, Samurai Showdown, and Mortal Kombat, just to name a few. However, even though they were great for the arcades, but trying to home port them to home consoles at the time was not. Not to say they weren't all bad, they were at least decent attempts, and most of them were okay ports. But by the time in the year 1994, it was simply clear. They cannot port a perfect arcade game to home consoles due to inferior hardware, limitation, and sacrificing it by cutting out stuff that wouldn't fit in the cartridge. It was like that ever since the very beginning of the Atari 2600, all the way up to the Genesis and Super NES. However, everything changed when the 5th generation was starting to take effect, and one of those was an arcade machine by Sega called Virtua Fighter, released around the world in 1993. This was revolutionary because it was the very first 3D fighting game ever made. It uses 3D polygons instead of 2D sprites, and it plays completely different compared to the other fighting games. But how will it do once it was ported to home consoles, to be more specifically, the upcoming Sega Saturn, since it was a Sega title? Well, to make it short, aside from graphical visuals, everything had stayed the same just like it did in the arcade version. And when it was ported to the Saturn in 1994 in Japan and 1995 in the rest of the world, it was a critical hit and big success in almost all the regions, and throwing the statement out of the window and proving that you can make an exact arcade port to home consoles, which it has now become possible thanks to the next-gen consoles. However, there was one company who got really jealous about the game's popularity, and that was Namco. Why to be exact? Well, you see, Namco and Sega were actually rivals in the arcade business ever since the beginning of the video game industries back in the 70s, with each arcade title trying to one-up each other, with each title being better than the rivals' versions, like Namco's Rally X to Sega's Turbo, and so on and so forth. After seeing the success of Sega's Virtua Fighter, both arcades and Sega consoles, Namco wanted their own version of Virtua Fighter, but more superior than their rival game. So they collaborated with Sony to create a new hardware board, which we will talk about later, and asked Saichi Ishii to direct and design the game, which he agrees. But it's actually shocking because not only he asked to make one of the most recognized games Namco has ever made, but if you look at his previous work he worked on as a game designer and coordinator, it was Virtua Fighter. Which is just a huge shock that he's responsible for making both games that were rivaling at each other at the time. Wow, story of his life. Along with gathering more designers from Virtua Fighter, as well as Namco's development team who had just finished on their 2D fighting game, Knuckleheads, everything was planned out, they started to make the game, and thus the development history begins. Now with that said, you may think they started working on a fighting game, right? Well, believe it or not, the game did not actually start out as a 3D fighting game at all. Instead, it started out as an internal Namco test case for animating 3D character models, and eventually incorporated texture mapping, much similar to Namco's previous arcade title, Ridge Racer. Until the company said, you know what, screw it, let's turn it into a fighting game. Originally, it was going to be titled Rave War, but in its final stages of development, it was changed to Tekken. The one thing that the developers were having a hard time, and it's the 3D character animations, which can be understandable since Namco was trying to push the 3D to the limit, and knowing that it was going to be a huge role in the video games, especially the upcoming generation. Before the arcade version was almost finished, they were making the designs of the characters, but most of them were very bizarre and feels out of place. Why to be exact? Well, you see, the development time had to be rushed, and many designers were made with completely separate people who worked on one of the characters. Although this worked out well and did manage to finish the characters, but it is still noticeable, and it still is to this very day. One of Namco's employees, Katsuhiro Harada, who started started out working on the first installment of the series as a voice actor, but then later on as a director, supervisor, and executive producer as years follows with each new installment of the series. Regretted ever thinking it was ever a good idea of making these haphazard characters, but at the time he said it was very unique seeing all of these characters and actually made the game stand out, which it did. When Tekken was released originally in the arcades internationally in December 1994, it was very well received by critics in Japan. Game Machine listed it on their February 1st, 1995 issue as being the 5th most successful arcade game of the year. However, it was no match with Sega's second 3D fighting installment, Virtua Fighter 2, which just blows it out of the arcades, which was even more impressive than the first. So, what did Namco decide to do? Well, it was obviously ported to home consoles, to be more specifically the PlayStation, since they had an agreement with Sony at the time, and was the key point of how the PlayStation became a successful console, and it was actually very easy to port it to the system compared to other arcade titles, which either downgrading it to fit or start from scratch. But how did they do it? Well, because the arcade game board unit was the Namco System 11, which is basically a PlayStation RAW board, using about 512 kilobytes operating system, with several custom processors, making Tekken the first game to use this system board. Heck, they even mention it in the back of the cover, which is one of the selling point of the game. But they didn't just make a straight arcade port to the system, they actually added in new features, like playing all the sub-boss characters, as well as the final boss, which is Heihachi, and Devil Kazuya as a bonus, exclusive to PlayStation only. But you can only access him by playing the 8 stages in Galaga. And yes, they pretty much did the exact same thing they featured in Ridge Racer, but it's Galaga instead of Galaxian. It used full motion video in both intro openings and character endings once you beat the game with the player you chose. The music was originally composed by Yoshie Awakawa and Yoshie Takayanagi in the arcade version. One of them did return and did the PlayStation version, which was Awakawa, along with 4 more, which are Shininiho Hoso, Nobuyoshi Sano, Takayuki Aihara, and Hiroto Sasaki. But we'll talk more about the music in the review part. When the PlayStation port was released in Japan in March 31st, 1995, Europe in November 7th, 1995, and North America in November 8th, 1995, it was even more received than its arcade original, with reviewers like Famitsu scored Tekken a 38 out of 40. A reviewer from Edged opinioned that despite lacking the overall visual allure of Virtua Fighter 2, Tekken not only matches the style and quality of Sega's character animation, but it pushes its rivals to the wire in playability terms too. Edge also appeared in the back in the box too, but with a different comment, saying Justos with Ridge Racer for consideration at the best PlayStation game yet. Another one by GamePro called the PlayStation version one of the best arcade-to-home translations ever, and commented that while the graphics look rough and blocky compared to Battle Arena Toshinden, the moves all have a clear and definitive usefulness. And finally, Maximum called it far and away the finest beat-em-up to grace this Super Console so far, citing the well-balanced player characters' innovated control mechanic of assigning one button to each limb, complexity of the moves, and 10 playable boss characters, and arguing that the game is superior to Toshinden in both gameplay and graphics. However, they did criticize the poor PAL version of the European release. One reviewer from Next Generation was sort of mixed about it, considering the game's graphics to be its weakest point, specifically the lack of animation on the backgrounds. they nonetheless consider it a new standard for polygonal fighting games, remarking in particular that the console are easy to master and every character in the game has their own unique and compelling special move. Outside of its reviews and in its commercial performance, Tekken became the first PlayStation game to sell over 1 million units. The game sold 830,000 units in Japan and 786,556 units in the United States. Both combined together, the full total is about 1,616,556 units sold. The game was also a bestseller in the United Kingdom and other PAL territories, even being awarded with multiple records in the Guinness World Records Gamers Edition 2008. These include first PlayStation game to sell over 1 million units, first fighting game to feature simulated 3D, and record for the entire series as the best-selling fighting series for the PlayStation consoles. So, after the great reviews and fame it got in its debut, did the first game stand up many years later? Well, let's get on to the review and find out. Before I talk about the review part, most of my points have stayed the same back in my old series, but if you're new to this video and want to hear them out, well, I'm going to do it right now. The graphics are a 50-50, with the 50 being the backgrounds and the ground are good for the most parts and do resembles the arcade game, since, like I said again, from the raw PlayStation board. However, the other 50 are the character models, and yeah, there's no way to defending it, they're kinda shit. Not to say they're not bad, I do find some of them to be okay, but the sequels came along for the system later on and look better in comparison to the first, and the producers don't like them to begin with in the first place. So if the people who made the first game thinks they're bad, then I can't blame them. And besides, it is an early 3D fighting game. The presentation is alright. You have your FMV video sequence from the intro openings all the way to the character endings. Although they were great back in 1995, but many years later, they did not age well. And they look terrifying when they open their mouths open, especially Law during the intro and ending as a cameo in Yoshimitsu's ending. Terrifying, isn't it? But the weird part of this is the ending to King, because instead of pre-rendered children, you have live-action children, and yeah, I have no comment but 2 words: completely uncanny. The options, as usual, have some stuff, like difficulties, control layouts, save features, and etc. And finally, in the game, you can switch to 4 different views by pressing the select button, which it actually shows in the game, and in the bottom right, you see the name of the location you're fighting in, which is a bit of a fine touch, if you ask me. The 2 things that I sorta have a nitpick on is the controls for the menu, which instead of pressing X like every single PS1 game, you have to press the start button. And second is the timer. I don't know why they added this in, maybe for like how long have you been playing, or if this have to do anything of getting a high score, but still, there's no reason why it needs to be there. And yes, I'm aware this is also featured in the arcade version too, but that still doesn't change anything. If someone knows, like a true fighting expert, about the timer, then leave a comment down below. The music is great, in my opinion. They completely nailed the soundtrack in its initial debut. It is filled with so many memorable themes, from pumping excitement or the slower adrenaline, or techno beats as usual. Even though these tracks cannot be compared to other Tekken games as the series follows, but it still is an awesome and kick-ass soundtrack, and highly recommended either if you're a fan or a non-fan to the series. There's also the arranged version exclusive to the system by changing it in the option menu. and it's just great as the original. Nothing more to comment on. And finally, the gameplay. It controls very tight and well balanced, thanks to the controls being ported right to the arcade, which is completely different to most arcade fighting games at the time. But I won't go over it, otherwise it will take longer. The fighters feature their own attacks like a bigger punch, a powerful kick, and so forth, which could be shown in the instructional manual. And at last, the special moves. Simply put it, hit the button combinations of each character and they would do a massive damage to the other opponent, and the main highlight of the game. Because holy damn, these special moves are really awesome and painful if you ever decide to actually mimic this. But don't do that in real life, otherwise people can get hurt and badly damaged. And that's really much it for the moves. So, as for me playing the game, I had a good time playing this in its early stages. That is, when I got to the middle part and could tell that the game becomes difficult, which is not a bad thing. People do like a good challenge. For me, I had a very hard time doing this because, you know, I'm not good at fighting games. However, unlike most fighting games where I usually give up at the middle or beginning, I actually made it all the way up to the end in the normal difficulty, which I call it impressive in me only. But still easily got beaten up with later opponents, especially when I made it to the sub-boss, which is Lee, and oh god, it was hell, and almost called it quits. But after losing to him over 100 times, if I was ever counting, I beat him and made it up to the final boss, which is Heihachi. And he is much tougher than Lee, and repeatedly got beaten over and over and over again. I was going to beat this game at the end until something distracted me when I looked over to my computer screen and did not press start at the continue screen. Meaning I lost, got game over, and have to start all the way back again. Which I just say no, because I am not going over that again and have to do other history/reviews on games as soon as possible. But at the very least, I had a good time and still managed to play all the way through the game, even though I never beaten the final boss. But now, let's go on to the conclusion. The game may have not aged well due to the characters' poor blocky designs, FMV sequence that had an uncanny design and large gaping mouths, and had to unlock sub-boss by playing each character, but even with that, this first entry was still good and like I said, had fun time playing this game, especially the music being kick-ass, either original or arranged, thanks to more gaming composers being from the console port. The series would become popular in the mid to late 90s, which includes an OVA animated movie, comics, and of course 2 sequels, being Tekken 2 in 1996 and Tekken 3 in 1998. Both of them we would come across for a very long time, along with 4 more sequels, spin-offs, more movies, and comics after the PS1 days were over, as well as an 8th game planning very soon, but has not yet announced by Bandai Namco, since they own the series now, so we just have to wait either next year or the year following. And that's really much it for now. All I can say left that the first game is good and mostly recommended either for novelty purposes where the series started, or you want to start a marathon of the series, being this one as the first. With everything said and done, I give my official rating a 4 out of 6. And that is 10 more games down on this list. And looking at the games after the launch, I could say that even though it may not be as strong, since in October there were only 5 games that were released, which they were mostly ports from the arcades and home computers, but they still kept it strong with a licensing agreement and a peripheral for most games that did had its successes at the time. So yeah, overall the system was still doing good even with a a little lacking of the exclusive titles. But don't worry, we still have 30 more games left in the series, and I found some very recognizable exclusive titles, starting with the next one being a game that is a combination between first-person and action platforming, and was the most recognized PS1 game in 1995 from Japan in today's video game world. What is that game? Well, we'll have to wait for it next time. If there were mistakes or forgot to mention from 10 reviews I made from Air Combat all the way to Tekken, leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching.